Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Ankur Desai, and alongside me on this episode, I am so pleased to say that I have my colleague and longtime China analyst Celia Hatton with me. Celia, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about, of course, Donald Trump's visit to China. So what's the tone been like so far?
It's really interesting to contrast. These are two men with very different personalities, two very different speaking styles. Throughout the course of this day, we've seen Donald Trump speak a couple of times and address Xi Jinping, address his delegation and the Chinese delegation. And he has been full of positive words, talking about his great relationship with Xi Jinping, what a great leader he is, really speaking off the cuff about what positive talks that they've had, and then even going on to say that he was looking forward to the state banquet because it was another cherished opportunity for the two sides to speak. So contrast that with Xi Jinping, where every time he spoke, he, clearly was speaking in a pre-planned way.
Very rehearsed,
very carefully chosen words. And his words were kind of positive if you look on the front of it. But I really think he was trying to achieve two different things. Every single time he spoke, he really wanted to make sure that the U.S. and China were put on par. He emphasized over and over again that these are two equals. They are two superpowers. It's not that China is kind of the little brother to the United States. And he took pains to talk about, for example, how achieving the Chinese dream, so the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is Xi Jinping's kind of grand vision for China, well, that was equal to the Make America Great Again idea. And so, saying that we can achieve these together. But there was another kind of darker undertone to what he was saying. He said several times that these two countries could achieve great things together, but they were also, capable of conflict. And he really wanted to bring that in, almost a bit of a warning at the end of many of his comments to say what could be at stake if they didn't get this relationship right. And that's just not something that we really heard from Donald Trump today.
So is that done deliberately to try and achieve some sort of an upper hand in this dynamic, so to speak?
I think so. I mean, he knows that, his one audience is that the Chinese people are watching this. This is being broadcast to everyone in China on Chinese state media. And so I think he wanted to make that very clear that these two men are equals. I think that probably was very well planned, that at first it would be Donald Trump going to China instead of Xi Jinping going to the United States. And I think also he wants to make sure to the wider world that China really is seen as a superpower on par with the United States. If anybody had any doubts, he wants to really underline that. And China really has spent a lot of time also kind of portraying itself as a country that speaks on behalf of poorer countries, that it's kind of it even describes itself still, even though it has the world's second biggest economy, it still describes itself as a developing country. And so it likes to portray itself in that way, but still a country that is an equal to the United States.
Well, what can we say that Donald Trump is trying to achieve then? With all this positive rhetoric and being so gracious as well, what sort of a tactic is that he's using in this?
I think you could probably argue that Donald Trump's handling of China hasn't quite gone as he intended for it to go. When we first saw the start of the second Trump administration, Donald Trump invited Xi Jinping to come to his inauguration. He really kind of extended a hand to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping turned down that invitation, I will say, and sent someone more junior to him. But I think that Donald Trump kind of went into this thinking that he could kind of manage China a little bit. Then he kicked off the tariff war, and that did not go the way that he was thinking it might. I think by all accounts, anybody who's watched that, China really managed that war. They didn't immediately dispatch a delegation to try to convince Trump. You didn't really hear for quite some time whether Xi Jinping and Donald Trump were going to have a phone call even after Donald Trump had announced massive tariffs on China. Instead, a few months later, that's when trade talks between the two sides began, and they negotiated a truce. This was after China started matching Donald Trump's tariffs. So they took a different tack, and I think a lot of people would argue that China actually managed the situation a lot better than some other countries who really tried to kowtow to the United States and decided to sign trade deals that now are being called into question.
If China wants to declare itself as such a strong power globally, well, what can we say about their diplomatic power as well as their influence as well, especially not just in the region but beyond?
I think China's really tried to manage its relationships with other countries that Donald Trump either needs to deal with or Donald Trump wants to deal with. It was really interesting while we were seeing Xi Jinping and Donald Trump today standing up in a state banquet and right in the center of Beijing in the Great Hall of the People. I was in a news studio at the time and I saw on my screen an announcement from the Kremlin, from Moscow, flash to say that President Putin had announced that he was set to visit Beijing next. He was going to meet with Xi Jinping, underlining the fact that President Putin and Xi Jinping are very, very close. You know, they have really long publicly declared that they have a very close relationship. So first we have China's relationship with Russia. That's something that sometimes Donald Trump needs help with and consults Xi Jinping on. Also, China has a very close relationship with Iran. It is a major buyer of Iranian oil. Donald Trump himself has publicly wavered on whether he needs China's help, but even he has admitted at times that he would want to consult Xi Jinping about Iran. And we've heard that that's happened today. In their meeting that the two men had today, Iran was one of the topics. And the U.S. delegation was quite pleased to say that Beijing agreed to help get the Iranians to lift the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz and get involved with Tehran. And so I think the United States really does lean on China for its diplomatic contacts at times.
And I guess China has been watching this war in Iran from an exercise of learning as well, in terms of how to, I guess, be quite smart diplomatically in terms of how to play this position of power.
Yeah, I mean, smart diplomatically, but also smart militarily. They've been able to see how the U.S. military operates, where its weaknesses are. It's quite valuable for China to be able to see that without having to get involved. You know, we've also seen many people have wondered how much China has benefited by the fact the United States has had to take some of its military assets out of the Asia-Pacific region and move them towards the Middle East. They've also, you know, the United States has drained a lot of its military resources by getting involved in the U.S.-Israel war with Iran. So I think, you know, there are many people in Beijing who, even though they're not applauding the fact that this war began, they've obviously suffered economically because of it. I think that they have benefited in many ways militarily by watching how this war has unfolded.
And you mentioned as well economics there. How has China been impacted through this war? And they haven't been immune to it, of course, and that's why they do have a firm interest in what happens in that region.
Yeah, economically, it has suffered because of the war. It hasn't done so bad, actually, economically so far this year. And I think that's because China's long-term strategic planning has allowed it to build up stockpiles of oil, stockpiles of weapons and different supplies that it needs. It's quite good at that kind of long-term planning. However, it's still an export-driven economy. It's still dependent on global consumption. It needs, basically, people around the world to keep going into shops and buying goods that are made in China. If that stops, for whatever reason, China is going to suffer. So China really does have a firm interest in seeing the conflict come to an end, seeing the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz to be lifted, not just so it can get more oil from Iran, but also so that the global economy bounces back and people start feeling confident and start buying again.
So, Celia, with China's economic position overall, how healthy is it or unhealthy?
So I mentioned that it has been suffering because of the war in Iran. It's also been suffering kind of these long-term economic challenges that it just can't seem to address. And so behind the curtain, China really is struggling in many ways. First, it's got an aging population. You know, at the moment, around a quarter of China's population is over the age of 60, which might not sound like that much, but actually that is going to grow exponentially. And China isn't a wealthy country per capita. Not everybody has a lot of money in their pocket. And so over the next few decades, we're really going to see China begin to suffer because they just don't have enough people paying taxes and being able to support the workforce. So that's a massive issue that they can't really address. They also just don't have enough people spending money within the country. Chinese people, I just mentioned they don't have a lot of money in their pockets, but they are known to be really eager savers. And that's because they feel like they have to care about education and healthcare and real estate and all the things that don't allow them to go out and just spend, spend, spend. So they have domestic economic problems that they can't kick. So, they need business deals as well with the United States. It's not just the U.S. coming and asking China to do business with the U.S. It's also that China needs that business to keep going as well.
So then if we look ahead, what does China need to do in terms of its approach with Donald Trump and in order to achieve its objectives going forward?
China has this way of operating that lets it look far into the future. They're very good at strategic long-term planning. The Communist Party operates with a 5-year plan. They set out their plan and they enact that plan. And they're very clear about what they're going to do. So I think that in a Trump era, that's actually really worked to their benefit because they haven't reacted very, very quickly every time Donald Trump says something. Instead, they've stuck with their plan. So even though they have big problems, as I've just said, I think that they also have sort of this nice long-term thinking that's let them do things like, shore up stocks of critical minerals that the United States needs, for example. So they've got lots of cards in their back pocket. I think the next thing we're really looking towards is 2027, next year. Xi Jinping doesn't have to contend with elections, but he does have to think about his own terms. Now, he was supposed to, under normal circumstances, a normal Chinese leader would serve 2 terms. Xi Jinping has now actually changed the entire rule book in China and allowed himself to serve a 3rd term. Next year, he could be entering into a 4th term. Possibly. We haven't actually heard from him what he's going to do. But it's also possible that he'll start to kind of nominate some people, so the next generation. We haven't seen him do that yet. And so I think that's going to be the next thing that we're going to be watching out for. Is he going to feel strong enough as a leader to feel that he can nominate the next round of people? Or are we going to interpret some weakness from him, some questions over how long he can remain in his position and keep addressing China's problems, or also managing his relationship with the United States?
Celia, as always, thank you for your time. Celia Hatton there, Asia analyst, and of course our colleague here on the Global News Podcast. Do subscribe and click on the link below for more Global News Podcast content, and we'll see you again on the next one.